13. Miracles. First published in The Guardian, 2nd of October 1942, the text was expanded and preached as a sermon in St. Jude on the Hill Church, London, subsequently appearing in St. Jude's Gazette, No. 73, October 1942. It was later published in Undeceptions, 1971, and is now in God in the Dock, 1998. I have known only one person in my life who claimed to have seen a ghost. It was a woman, and the interesting thing is that she disbelieved in the immortality of the soul before seeing the ghost, and still disbelieves after having seen it. She thinks it was a hallucination. In other words, seeing is not believing. This is the first thing to get clear in talking about miracles. Whatever experiences we may have, we shall not regard them as miraculous if we already hold a philosophy which excludes the supernatural. Any event which is claimed as a miracle is, in the last resort, an experience received from the senses, and the senses are not infallible. We can always say we have been the victims of an illusion. If we disbelieve in the supernatural, this is what we always shall say. Hence, whether miracles have really ceased or not, they would certainly appear to cease in Western Europe as materialism became the popular creed. For let us make no mistake, if the end of the world appeared in all the literal trappings of the apocalypse, the modern materialist saw with his own eyes the heavens rolled up, Revelation chapter 6, verse 14, and the great white throne appearing, chapter 20, verse 11. If he had the sensation of being himself hurled into the lake of fire, chapter 19, verse 20, chapter 20, verses 10, 14, and 15, chapter 21, verse 8. He would continue forever in that lake itself, to regard his experience as an illusion, and to find the explanation of it in psychoanalysis or cerebral pathology. Experience by itself proves nothing. If a man doubts whether he is dreaming or waking, no experiment can solve his doubt, since every experiment may itself be part of the dream. Experience proves this or that or nothing according to the preconceptions we bring to it. This fact, that the interpretation of experience depends on preconceptions, is often used as an argument against miracles. It is said that our ancestors, taking the supernatural for granted and greedy of wonders, read the miraculous into events that were really not miracles. And in a sense I grant it. That is to say, I think that just as our preconceptions would prevent us from apprehending miracles if they really occurred, so their preconceptions would lead them to imagine miracles even if they did not occur. In the same way, the doting man will think his wife faithful when she is not, and the suspicious man will not think her faithful when she is. The question of her actual fidelity remains meanwhile to be settled, if at all, on other grounds. But there is one thing often said about our ancestors which we must not say. We must not say, they believed in miracles because they did not know the laws of nature. This is nonsense. When St. Joseph discovered that his bride was pregnant, he was minded to put her away. Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. He knew enough biology for that. Otherwise, of course, he would not have regarded pregnancy as a proof of infidelity. When he accepted the Christian explanation, he regarded it as a miracle precisely because he knew enough of the laws of nature to know that this was a suspension of them. When the disciples saw Christ walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14, verse 26, Mark chapter 6, verse 49, John chapter 6, verse 19, they were frightened. They would not have been frightened unless they had known the laws of nature and known that this was an exception. If a man had no conception of a regular order in nature, then of course he could not notice departures from that order. Just as a dunce who does not understand the normal metre of a poem is also unconscious of the poet's variations from it. Nothing is wonderful except the abnormal, and nothing is abnormal until we have grasped the norm. Complete ignorance of the laws of nature would preclude the perception of the miraculous just as rigidly as complete disbelief in the supernatural precludes it, perhaps even more so. For while the materialist would have at least to explain miracles away, the man wholly ignorant of nature would simply not notice them. The experience of a miracle, in fact, requires two conditions. First, we must believe in a normal stability of nature, which means we must recognize that the data offered by our senses recur in regular patterns. Secondly, we must believe in some reality beyond nature. When both beliefs are held, and not till then, we can approach with an open mind the various reports which claim that this super or extra-natural reality has sometimes invaded and disturbed the sensuous content of space and time which makes our natural world. The belief in such a supernatural reality itself can neither be proved nor disproved by experience. The arguments for its existence are metaphysical and to me conclusive. They turn on the fact that even to think and act in the natural world, we have to assume something beyond it, and even assume that we partly belong to that something. In order to think, we must claim for our own reasoning a validity which is not credible if our thought is merely a function of our brain, and our brains a byproduct of irrational physical processes. In order to act above the level of mere impulse, we must claim a similar validity for our judgments of good and evil. In both cases, we get the same disquieting result. The concept of nature itself is one we have reached only tacitly by claiming a sort of supernatural status for ourselves. If we frankly accept this position and then turn to the evidence, we find, of course, that accounts of the supernatural meet us on every side. History is full of them, often in the same documents which we accept wherever they do not report miracles. Respectable missionaries report them not infrequently. The whole Church of Rome claims their continued occurrence. Intimate conversation elicits from almost every acquaintance at least one episode in his life which is what he would call queer or rum. No doubt most stories of miracles are unreliable, but then, as anyone can see by reading the papers, so are most stories of all events. Each story must be taken on its merits. What one must not do is to rule out the supernatural as the one impossible explanation. Thus you may disbelieve in the Mons angels because you cannot find a sufficient number of sensible people who say they saw them. But if you found a sufficient number, it would, in my view, be unreasonable to explain this by collective hallucination. For we know enough of psychology to know that spontaneous unanimity in hallucination is very improbable. And we do not know enough of the supernatural to know that a manifestation of angels is equally improbable. The supernatural theory is the less improbable of the two. When the Old Testament says that Sennacherib's invasion was stopped by angels, 2 Kings chapter 19 verse 35, and Herodotus says it was stopped by a lot of mice who came and ate up all the bowstrings of his army, an open-minded man will be on the side of the angels. Unless you start by begging the question, there is nothing intrinsically unlikely in the existence of angels, or in the action ascribed to them. But mice just don't do these things. A great deal of skepticism now current about the miracles of our Lord does not, however, come from disbelief of all reality beyond nature. It comes from two ideas which are respectable but I think mistaken. In the first place, modern people have an almost aesthetic dislike of miracles. Admitting that God can, they doubt if he would. To violate the laws he himself has imposed on his creation seems to them arbitrary, clumsy, a theatrical device only fit to impress savages, a solecism against the grammar of the universe. In the second place, many people confuse the laws of nature with the laws of thought, and imagine that their reversal or suspension would be a contradiction in terms, as if the resurrection of the dead were the same sort of thing as 2 and 2 making 5. I have only recently found the answer to the first objection. I found it first in George MacDonald, and later in St. Athanasius. This is what St. Athanasius says in his little book on the Incarnation. Our Lord took a body like ours and lived as a man, in order that those who had refused to recognize him in his superintendence and captaincy of the whole universe might come to recognize from the works he did here below in the body that what dwelled in this body was the Word of God. This accords exactly with Christ's own account of his miracles. The Son can do nothing of himself but what he seeth the Father do. John chapter 5 verse 19. The doctrine, as I understand it, is something like this. There is an activity of God displayed throughout creation, a wholesale activity, let us say, which men refuse to recognize. The miracles done by God incarnate, living as a man in Palestine, perform the very same things as this wholesale activity, but at a different speed and on a smaller scale. One of their chief purposes is that men, having seen a thing done by personal power on the small scale, may recognize, when they see the same thing done on the large scale, that the power behind it is also personal, is indeed the very same person who lived among us 2,000 years ago. The miracles, in fact, are a retelling in small letters of the very same story which is written across the whole world in letters too large for some of us to see. Of that larger script, part is already visible, part is still unsolved. In other words, some of the miracles do locally what God has already done universally. Others do locally what he has not yet done but will do. In that sense, and from our human point of view, some are reminders and others prophecies. God creates the vine, and teaches it to draw up water by its roots, and, with the aid of the sun, to turn that water into a juice which will ferment and take on certain qualities. Thus, every year, from Noah's time till ours, God turns water into wine. That men fail to see. Either, like the pagans, they refer the process to some finite spirit, Bacchus or Dionysus, or else, like the moderns, they attribute real and ultimate causality to the chemical and other material phenomena which are all that our senses can discover in it. But when Christ at Cana makes water into wine, the mask is off. John chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. The miracle has only half its effect if it only convinces us that Christ is God. It will have its full effect if, whenever we see a vineyard or drink a glass of wine, we remember that here works he who sat at the wedding party in Cana. Every year God makes a little corn into much corn. The seed is sown, and there is an increase, and men, according to the fashion of their age, say, "It is Ceres, it is Adonis, it is the corn king," or else, "It is the laws of nature." The close-up, the translation of this annual wonder, is the feeding of the 5,000. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 to 21, Mark chapter 6, verses 34 to 44, Luke chapter 9, verses 12 to 17, John chapter 6, verses 1 to 11. Bread is not made there of nothing. Bread is not made of stones, as the devil once suggested to our Lord in vain. Matthew chapter 4, verse 3, Luke chapter 4, verse 3. A little bread is made into much bread. The Son will do nothing but what he sees the Father do. There is, so to speak, a family style. The miracles of healing fall into the same pattern. This is sometimes obscured for us by the somewhat magical view we tend to take of ordinary medicine. The doctors themselves do not take this view. The magic is not in the medicine, but in the patient's body. What the doctor does is to stimulate nature's functions in the body, or to remove hindrances. In a sense, though we speak for convenience of healing a cut, every cut heals itself. No dressing will make skin grow over a cut on a corpse. That same mysterious energy which we call gravitational when it steers the planets, and biochemical when it heals a body, is the efficient cause of all recoveries. And if God exists, that energy, directly or indirectly, is his. All who are cured by him, the healer within. But once he did it visibly, a man meeting a man. Where he does not work within in this mode, the organism dies. Hence, Christ's one miracle of destruction is also in harmony with God's wholesale activity. His bodily hand, held out in symbolic wrath, blasted a single fig tree. Matthew chapter 21, verse 19, Mark chapter 11, verses 13 to 20. But no tree died that year in Palestine, or any year, or in any land, or even ever will, save because he has done something, or, more likely, ceased to do something to it. When he fed the thousands, he multiplied fish as well as bread. Look in every bay and almost every river. This swarming, pulsating fecundity shows he is still at work. The ancients had a god called Genius, the god of animal and human fertility. the presiding spirit of gynecology, embryology, or the marriage bed, the genial bed, as they called it after its god Genius. As the miracles of wine and bread and healing showed who Bacchus really was, who Ceres, who Apollo, and that all were one, so this miraculous multiplication of fish reveals the real genius. And with that we stand at the threshold of the miracle which, for some reason, most offends modern ears. I can understand the man who denies the miraculous altogether. But what does one make of the people who admit some miracles but deny the virgin birth? Is it that for all their lip service to the laws of nature, there is only one law of nature that they really believe? Or is it that they see in this miracle a slur upon sexual intercourse, which is rapidly becoming the one thing venerated in a world without veneration? No miracle is, in fact, more significant. What happens in ordinary generation? What is a father's function in the act of begetting? A microscopic particle of matter from his body fertilizes the female. And with that microscopic particle passes, it may be, the colour of his hair, and his great-grandfather's hanging lip, and the human form in all its complexity of bones, liver, sinews, heart, and limbs, and pre-human form which the embryo will recapitulate in the womb. Behind every spermatozoon lies the whole history of the universe. Locked within it is no small part of the world's future. That is God's normal way of making a man, a process that takes centuries, beginning with the creation of matter itself, and narrowing to 1 second and 1 particle at the moment of begetting. And once again, men will mistake the sense impressions which this creative act throws off for the act itself, or else refer it to some finite being such as genius. Once, therefore, God does it directly, instantaneously, without a spermatozoon, without the millenniums of organic history behind the spermatozoon. There was, of course, another reason. This time he was creating not simply a man, but the man who was to be himself, the only true man. The process which leads to the spermatozoon has carried down with it through the centuries much undesirable silt. The life which reaches us by that normal route is tainted. To avoid that taint, to give humanity a fresh start, he once short-circuited the process. There is a vulgar anti-God paper which some anonymous donor sends me every week. In it recently I saw the taunt that we Christians believe in a God who committed adultery with the wife of a Jewish carpenter. The answer to that is that if you describe the action of God in fertilizing Mary as adultery, then, in that sense, God would have committed adultery with every woman who ever had a baby. For what he did once without a human father, he does always, even when he uses a human father as his instrument. For the human father in ordinary generation is only a carrier, sometimes an unwilling carrier, always the last in a long line of carriers of life that comes from the supreme life. Thus the filth that our poor, muddled, sincere, resentful enemies fling at the Holy One either does not stick, or, sticking, turns into glory. So much for the miracles which do, small and quick, what we have already seen in the large letters of God's universal activity. But before I go on to the second class, those which foreshadow parts of the universal activity we have not yet seen, I must guard against a misunderstanding. Do not imagine I am trying to make the miracles less miraculous. I am not arguing that they are more probable because they are less unlike natural events. I am trying to answer those who think them arbitrary, theatrical, unworthy of God, meaningless interruptions of universal order. They remain, in my view, wholly miraculous. To do instantly with dead and baked corn what ordinarily happens slowly with live seed is just as great a miracle as to make bread of stones. Just as great, but a different kind of miracle. That is the point. When I open Ovid or Grimm, I find the sort of miracles which really would be arbitrary. Trees talk, houses turn into trees, magic rings raise tables richly spread with food in lonely places, ships become goddesses, and men are changed into snakes or birds or bears. It is fun to read about. The least suspicion that it had really happened would turn that fun into nightmare. You find no miracles of that kind in the Gospels. Such things, if they could be, would prove that some alien power was invading nature. They would not in the least prove that it was the same power which had made nature and rules her every day. But the true miracles express not simply a God, but God, that which is outside nature, not as a foreigner, but as her sovereign. They announce not merely that a king has visited our town, but that it is the king, our king. The second class of miracles, on this view, foretell what God has not yet done, but will do universally. He raised one man, the man who was himself, from the dead, because he will one day raise all men from the dead. Perhaps not only men, for there are hints in the New Testament that all creation will eventually be rescued from decay, restored to shape, and subserve the splendor of remade humanity. The Transfiguration, Matthew chapter 17 verses 1 to 9, Mark chapter 9 verses 2 to 10, and the walking on the water, Matthew chapter 14 verse 26, Mark chapter 6 verse 49, John chapter 6 verse 19, are glimpses of the beauty and the effortless power over all matter which will belong to men when they are really waked by God. Now, resurrection certainly involves reversal of natural process, in the sense that it involves a series of changes moving in the opposite direction to those we see. At death, matter which has been organic falls back gradually into the inorganic, to be finally scattered and used perhaps in other organisms. Resurrection would be the reverse process. It would not, of course, mean the restoration to each personality of those very atoms, numerically the same, which had made its first or natural body. There would not be enough to go round, for one thing, and for another, the unity of the body, even in this life, was consistent with a slow but perplexed change of its actual ingredients. But it certainly does mean matter of some kind rushing towards organism as we now see it rushing away. It means, in fact, playing backwards a film we have already seen played forwards. In that sense, it is reversal of nature. But, of course, it is a further question whether reversal in this sense is necessarily contradiction. Do we know that the film cannot be played backwards? Well, in one sense, it is precisely the teaching of modern physics that the film never works backwards. For modern physics, as you have heard before, the universe is running down. Disorganization and chance are continually increasing. There will come a time, not infinitely remote, when it will be wholly run down, or wholly disorganized, and science knows of no possible return from that state. There must have been a time, not infinitely remote, in the past, when it was wound up, though science knows of no winding-up process. The point is that for our ancestors the universe was a picture. For modern physics it is a story. If the universe is a picture, these things either appear in that picture or not, and if they don't, since it is an infinite picture, one may suspect that they are contrary to the nature of things. But a story is a different matter, especially if it is an incomplete story. And the story told by modern physics might be told briefly in the words, Humpty Dumpty was falling. That is, it proclaims itself an incomplete story. There must have been a time before he fell, when he was sitting on the wall. There must be a time after he has reached the ground. It is quite true that science knows of no horses and men who can put him together again once he has reached the ground and broken. But then, she also knows of no means by which he could originally have been put on the wall. You wouldn't expect her to. All science rests on observation. All our observations are taken during Humpty Dumpty's fall, because we were born after he lost his seat on the wall, and shall be extinct long before he reaches the ground. But to assume from observations taken while the clock is running down that the unimaginable winding up which must have preceded this process cannot occur when the process is over is the merest dogmatism. From the very nature of the case, the laws of degradation and disorganization which we find in matter at present cannot be the ultimate and eternal nature of things. If they were, there would have been nothing to degrade and disorganize. Humpty Dumpty can't fall off a wall that never existed. Obviously, an event which lies outside the falling or disintegrating process which we know as nature is not imaginable. If anything is clear from the records of our Lord's appearances after his resurrection, it is that the risen body was very different from the body that died, and that it lives under conditions quite unlike those of natural life. It is frequently not recognized by those who see it. Luke chapter 24, verses 13 to 31 and 36 to 37. John chapter 20, verses 14 to 16. And it is not related to space in the same way as our bodies. The sudden appearances and disappearances, Mark chapter 16, verse 14, Luke chapter 24, verses 31 and 36, John chapter 20, verses 19 and 26, suggest the ghost of popular tradition. Yet he emphatically insists that he is not merely a spirit, and takes steps to demonstrate that the risen body can still perform animal operations, such as eating. Luke chapter 24, verses 42 and 43, John chapter 21, verse 13. What makes all this baffling to us is our assumption that to pass beyond what we call nature, beyond the 3 dimensions and the 5 highly specialized and limited senses, is immediately to be in a world of pure negative spiritually, a world where space of any sort and sense of any sort have no function. I know no grounds for believing this. To explain even an atom, Schrödinger wants 7 dimensions, and give us new senses, and we should find a new nature. There may be natures piled upon natures, each supernatural to the one beneath it, before we come to the abyss of pure spirit. And to be in that abyss, at the right hand of the Father, may not mean being absent from any of these natures, may mean a yet more dynamic presence on all levels. That is why I think it very rash to assume that the story of the Ascension is mere allegory. I know it sounds like the work of people who imagined an absolute up and down and a local heaven in the sky. But to say this is, after all, to say, assuming that the story is fake, we could thus explain how it arose. Without that assumption, we find ourselves moving about in worlds unrealized, with no probability or improbability to guide us. For if the story is true, then a being still in some mode, though not our mode, corporeal, withdrew at his own will from the nature presented by our 3 dimensions and 5 senses, not necessarily into the non-sensuous and undimensioned, but possibly into or through a world or worlds of supersense and superspace. And he might choose to do it gradually. Who on earth knows what the spectators might see? If they say they saw a momentary movement along the vertical plane, then an indistinct mass, then nothing, who is to pronounce this improbable? My time is nearly up, and I must be very brief with the second class of people whom I promised to deal with. Those who mistake the laws of nature for laws of thought, and, therefore, think that any departure from them is a self-contradiction, like a square circle or 2 and 2 making 5. To think this is to imagine that the normal processes of nature are transparent to the intellect, that we can say why she behaves as she does. For, of course, if we cannot see why a thing is so, then we cannot see any reason why it should not be otherwise. But in fact, the actual course of nature is wholly inexplicable. I don't mean that science has not yet explained it, but may do some day. I mean that the very nature of explanation makes it impossible that we should even explain why matter has the properties it has. For explanation, by its very nature, deals with a world of ifs and ands. Every explanation takes the form, since A, therefore B, or if C, then D. In order to explain any event, you have to assume the universe as a going concern, a machine working in a particular way. Since this particular way of working is the basis of all explanation, it can never be itself explained. We can see no reason why it should not have worked a different way. To say this is not only to remove the suspicion that miracle is self-contradictory, but also to realize how deeply right St. Athanasius was when he found an essential likeness between the miracles of our Lord and the general order of nature. Both are a full stop for the explaining intellect. If the natural means that which can be fitted into a class, that which obeys a norm, that which can be paralleled, that which can be explained by reference to other events, then nature herself as a whole is not natural. If a miracle means that which must simply be accepted, the unanswerable actuality which gives no account of itself but simply is, then the universe is one great miracle. To direct us to that great miracle is one main object of the earthly acts of Christ. They are, as he himself said, signs. Matthew chapter 12 verse 39, chapter 16 verse 4, chapter 24 verses 24 and 30, Mark chapter 13 verse 22, chapter 16 verses 17 and 20, Luke chapter 21 verses 11 and 25. They serve to remind us that the explanations of particular events which we derived from the given, the unexplained, the almost willful character of the actual universe are not explanations of that character. These signs do not take us away from reality, they recall us to it, recall us from our dream world of ifs and ands to the stunning actuality of everything that is real. They are focal points at which more reality becomes visible than we ordinarily see at once. I have spoken of how he made miraculous bread and wine, and of how, when the Virgin conceived, he had shown himself the true genius whom men had ignorantly worshipped long before. It goes deeper than that. Bread and wine were to have an even more sacred significance for Christians, and the act of generation was to be the chosen symbol among all mystics for the union of the soul with God. These things are no accidents. With him there are no accidents. When he created the vegetable world, he knew already what dreams the annual death and resurrection of the corn would cause to stir in pious pagan minds. He knew already that he himself must so die and live again, and in what sense, including and far transcending the old religion of the Corn King. He would say, "This is my body," Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, Mark chapter 14, verse 22, Luke chapter 22, verse 19, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 24. Common bread, miraculous bread, sacramental bread. These three are distinct, but not to be separated. Divine reality is like a fugue. All his acts are different, but they all rhyme or echo to one another. It is this that makes Christianity so difficult to talk about. Fix your mind on any one story or any one doctrine, and it becomes at once a magnet to which truth and glory come rushing from all levels of being. Our featureless pantheistic unities and glib rationalist distinctions are alike defeated by the seamless yet ever-varying texture of reality, the liveness, the elusiveness, the intertwined harmonies of the multidimensional fertility of God. But if this is the difficulty, it is also one of the firm grounds of our belief. To think that this was a fable, a product of our own brains as they are a product of matter, would be to believe that this vast symphonic splendor had come out of something much smaller and emptier than itself. It is not so. We are nearer to the truth in the vision seen by Julian of Norwich, when Christ appeared to her holding in his hand a little thing like a hazelnut, and saying, "This is all that is created." And it seemed to her so small and weak that she wondered how it could hold together at all. (40) Answers to Questions on Christianity. First published as a pamphlet by the Electrical and Musical Industries Christian Fellowship, Hayes, Middlesex, 1944, and subsequently in Undeceptions, 1971, and Timeless at Heart, 1991. Lewis. I have been asked to open with a few words on Christianity and modern industry. Now, modern industry is a subject of which I know nothing at all. But for that very reason, it may illustrate what Christianity, in my opinion, does and does not do. Christianity does not replace the technical. When it tells you to feed the hungry, it doesn't give you lessons in cookery. If you want to learn that, you must go to a cook rather than a Christian. If you are not a professional economist and have no experience of industry, simply being a Christian won't give you the answer to industrial problems. My own idea is that modern industry is a radically hopeless system. You can improve wages, hours, conditions, etc., but all that doesn't cure the deepest trouble, i.e., that numbers of people are kept all their lives doing dull repetition work, which gives no full play to their faculties. How that is to be overcome I do not know. If a single country abandoned the system, it would merely fall a prey to the other countries which hadn't abandoned it. I don't know the solution. That is not the kind of thing Christianity teaches a person like me. Let's now carry on with the questions. Question 1. Christians are taught to love their neighbours. How, therefore, can they justify their attitude of supporting the war? Lewis. You are told to love your neighbour as yourself. How do you love yourself? When I look into my own mind, I find that I do not love myself by thinking myself a dear old chap, or having affectionate feelings. I do not think that I love myself because I am particularly good, but just because I am myself, and quite apart from my character. I might detest something which I have done. Nevertheless, I do not cease to love myself. In other words, that definite distinction that Christians make between hating sin and loving the sinner is one that you have been making in your own case since you were born. You dislike what you have done, but you don't cease to love yourself. You may even think that you ought to be hanged. You may even think that you ought to go to the police and own up and be hanged. Love is not an affectionate feeling, but a steady wish for the loved person's ultimate good as far as it can be obtained. It seems to me, therefore, that when the worst comes to the worst, if you cannot restrain a man by any method except by trying to kill him, then a Christian must do that. That is my answer, but I may be wrong. It is very difficult to answer, of course. Question 2. Supposing a factory worker asked you, "How can I find God?" How would you reply? Lewis. I don't see how the problem would be different for a factory worker than for anyone else. The primary thing about any man is that he is a human being, sharing all the ordinary human temptations and assets. What is the special problem about the factory worker? But perhaps it is worth saying this. Christianity really does two things about conditions here and now in this world. 1. It tries to make them as good as possible, i.e., to reform them. But also, 2. It fortifies you against them insofar as they remain bad. If what was in the questioner's mind was this problem of repetition work, then the factory worker's difficulty is the same as any other man confronted with any sorrow or difficulty. People will find God if they consciously seek from him the right attitude towards all unpleasant things, if that is the point of the question. Question 3. Will you please say how you would define a practicing Christian? Are there any other varieties? Lewis. Certainly there are a great many other varieties. It depends, of course, on what you mean by practicing Christian. If you mean one who has practiced Christianity in every respect at every moment of his life, then there is only one on record, Christ himself. In that sense, there are no practicing Christians, but only Christians who, in varying degrees, try to practice it and fail in varying degrees, and then start again. A perfect practice of Christianity would, of course, consist in a perfect imitation of the life of Christ. I mean, insofar as it was applicable in one's own particular circumstances. Not in an idiotic sense. It doesn't mean that every Christian should grow a beard, or be a bachelor, or become a travelling preacher. It means that every single act and feeling, every experience, whether pleasant or unpleasant, must be referred to God. It means looking at everything as something that comes from him, and always looking to him and asking his will first, and saying, "How would he wish me to deal with this?" A kind of picture or pattern, in a very remote way, of the relation between the perfect Christian and his God would be the relation of the good dog to its master. This is only a very imperfect picture, though, because the dog hasn't reason like its master, whereas we do share in God's reason, even if in an imperfect and uninterrupted way. Interrupted because we don't think rationally for very long at a time. It's too tiring, and we haven't information to understand things fully, and our intelligence itself has certain limitations. In that way, we are more like God than the dog is like us, though, of course, there are other ways in which the dog is more like us than we are like God. It is only an illustration. Question 4. What justification, on ethical grounds and on the grounds of social expediency, exists for the Church's attitude towards venereal disease and prophylaxis and publicity in connection with it? Lewis. I need further advice on that question, and then perhaps I can answer it. Can the questioner say which church he has in mind? Voice. The church concerned is the Church of England, and its attitude, though not written, is implicit in that it has more or less banned all publicity in connection with prophylactic methods of combating venereal disease. The view of some is that moral punishment should not be avoided. Lewis: I haven't myself met any clergyman of the Church of England who held that view, and I don't hold it myself. There are obvious objections to it. After all, it isn't only venereal disease that can be regarded as a punishment for bad conduct. Indigestion in old age may be the result of overeating in earlier life, but no one objects to advertisements for Beecham's pills. I, at any rate, strongly dissent from the view that you've mentioned. Question 5. Many people feel resentful or unhappy because they think they are the target of unjust fate. These feelings are stimulated by bereavement, illness, deranged domestic or working conditions, or the observation of suffering in others. What is the Christian view of this problem? Lewis: The Christian view is that men are created to be in a certain relationship to God. If we are in that relation to Him, the right relation to one another will follow inevitably. Christ said it was difficult for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven. Matthew chapter 19, verse 23, Mark chapter 10, verse 23, Luke chapter 18, verse 24, referring, no doubt, to riches in the ordinary sense. But I think it really covers riches in every sense: good fortune, health, popularity, and all the things one wants to have. All these things tend, just as money tends, to make you feel independent of God, because if you have them, you are happy already and contented in this life. You don't want to turn away to anything more, and so you try to rest in a shadowy happiness, as if it could last forever. But God wants to give you a real and eternal happiness. Consequently, He may have to take all these riches away from you. If He doesn't, you will go on relying on them. It sounds cruel, doesn't it? But I am beginning to find out that what people call the cruel doctrines are really the kindest ones in the long run. I used to think it was a cruel doctrine to say that troubles and sorrows were punishments. But I find in practice that when you are in trouble, the moment you regard it as a punishment, it becomes easier to bear. If you think of this world as a place intended simply for our happiness, you find it quite intolerable. Think of it as a place of training and correction, and it's not so bad. Imagine a set of people all living in the same building. Half of them think it is a hotel, the other half think it is a prison. Those who think it a hotel might regard it as quite intolerable, and those who thought it was a prison might decide that it was really surprisingly comfortable. So that what seems the ugly doctrine is the one that comforts and strengthens you in the end. The people who try to hold an optimistic view of this world will become pessimists. The people who hold a pretty stern view of it become optimistic. Question 6. Materialists and some astronomers suggest that the solar planetary system and life as we know it was brought about by an accidental stellar collision. What is the Christian view of this theory? Lewis: If the solar system was brought about by an accidental collision, then the appearance of organic life on this planet was also an accident, and the whole evolution of man was an accident too. If so, then all our present thoughts are mere accidents, the accidental byproduct of the movement of atoms. And this holds for the thoughts of the materialists and astronomers as well as for anyone else's. But if their thoughts, i.e., of materialism and astronomy, are merely accidental byproducts, why should we believe them to be true? I see no reason for believing that one accident should be able to give me a correct account of all the other accidents. It's like expecting that the accidental shape taken by the splash when you upset a milk jug should give you a correct account of how the jug was made and why it was upset. Question 7. Is it true that Christianity, especially the Protestant forms, tends to produce a gloomy, joyless condition of society which is like a pain in the neck to most people? Lewis: As to the distinction between Protestant and other forms of Christianity, it is very difficult to answer. I find by reading about the 16th century that people like Sir Thomas More, for whom I have a great respect, always regarded Martin Luther's doctrines not as gloomy thinking, but as wishful thinking. I doubt whether we can make a distinction between Protestant and other forms in this respect. Whether Protestantism is gloomy, and whether Christianity at all produces gloominess, I find it very difficult to answer, as I have never lived in a completely non-Christian society, nor a completely Christian one, and I wasn't there in the 16th century, and only have my knowledge from reading books. I think there is about the same amount of fun and gloom in all periods. The poems, novels, letters, etc. of every period all seem to show that. But again, I don't really know the answer, of course. I wasn't there. Question 8. Is it true that Christians must be prepared to live a life of personal discomfort and self-sacrifice in order to qualify for pie in the sky? Lewis. All people, whether Christians or not, must be prepared to live a life of discomfort. It is impossible to accept Christianity for the sake of finding comfort. But the Christian tries to lay himself open to the will of God, to do what God wants him to do. You don't know in advance whether God is going to set you to do something difficult or painful, or something that you will quite like. And some people of heroic mould are disappointed when the job doled out to them turns out to be something quite nice. But you must be prepared for the unpleasant things and the discomforts. I don't mean fasting and things like that. They are a different matter. When you are training soldiers in manoeuvres, you practice with blank ammunition, because you would like them to have practice before meeting the real enemy. So we must practice in abstaining from pleasures which are not in themselves wicked. If you don't abstain from pleasure, you won't be good when the time comes along. It is purely a matter of practice. Voice. Are not practices like fasting and self-denial borrowed from earlier or more primitive religions? Lewis. I can't say for certain which bits came into Christianity from earlier religions. An enormous amount did. I should find it hard to believe Christianity if that were not so. I couldn't believe that 999 religions were completely false and the remaining one true. In reality, Christianity is primarily the fulfillment of the Jewish religion, but also the fulfillment of what was vaguely hinted in all the religions at their best. What was vaguely seen in them all comes into focus in Christianity, just as God himself comes into focus by becoming a man. I take it that the speaker's remarks on earlier religions are based on evidence about modern savages. I don't think it is good evidence. Modern savages usually represent some decay in culture. You find them doing things which look as if they had a fairly civilized basis once, which they have forgotten. To assume that primitive man was exactly like the modern savage is unsound. A voice. Could you say any more on how one discovers whether a task is laid on one by God or whether it comes in some other way? If we cannot distinguish between the pleasant and the unpleasant things, it is a complicated matter. Lewis. We are guided by the ordinary rules of moral behavior, which I think are more or less common to the human race and quite reasonable and demanded by the circumstances. I don't mean anything like sitting down and waiting for a supernatural vision. A voice. We don't qualify for heaven by practice, but salvation is obtained at the cross. We do nothing to obtain it but follow Christ. We may have pain or tribulation, but nothing we do qualifies us for heaven but Christ. Lewis. The controversy about faith and works is one that has gone on for a very long time, and it is a highly technical matter. I personally rely on the paradoxical text, "Work out your own salvation, for it is God that worketh in you." Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. It looks as if in one sense we do nothing, and in another case we do a damned lot. Work out your own salvation with fear and trembling, but you must have it in you before you can work it out. But I have no wish to go further into it, as it would interest no one but the Christians present, would it? Question 9. Would the application of Christian standards bring an end or greatly reduce scientific and material progress? In other words, is it wrong for a Christian to be ambitious and strive for personal success? Lewis. It is easier to think of a simplified example. How would the application of Christianity affect anyone on a desert island? Would he be less likely to build a comfortable hut? The answer is no. There might come a particular moment, of course, when Christianity would tell him to bother less about the hut, i.e., if he were in danger of coming to think that the hut was the most important thing in the universe. but there is no evidence that Christianity would prevent him from building it. Ambition. We must be careful what we mean by it. If it means the desire to get ahead of other people, which is what I think it does mean, then it is bad. If it means simply wanting to do a thing well, then it is good. It isn't wrong for an actor to want to act his part as well as it can possibly be acted, but the wish to have his name in bigger type than the other actors is a bad one. A voice. It's all right to be a general, but if it is one's ambition to be a general, then you shouldn't become one. Lewis. The mere event of becoming a general isn't either right or wrong in itself. What matters morally is your attitude towards it. The man may be thinking about winning a war. He may be wanting to be a general because he honestly thinks that he has a good plan and is glad of a chance to carry it out. That's all right. But if he is thinking, what can I get out of the job? Or how can I get on the front page of the Illustrated News? Then it is all wrong. And what we call ambition usually means the wish to be more conspicuous or more successful than someone else. It is this competitive element in it that is bad. It is perfectly reasonable to want to dance well or to look nice. But when the dominant wish is to dance better or look nicer than the others, when you begin to feel that if the others danced as well as you or looked as nice as you, that would take all the fun out of it, then you are going wrong. A voice. I am wondering how far we can ascribe to the work of the devil those very legitimate desires that we indulge in. Some people have a very sensitive conception of the presence of the devil. Others haven't. Is the devil as real as we think he is? That doesn't trouble some people, since they have no desire to be good, but others are continually harassed by the old man himself. Lewis. No reference to the devil or devils is included in any Christian creeds, and it is quite possible to be a Christian without believing in them. I do believe such beings exist, but that is my own affair. Supposing there to be such beings, the degree to which humans were conscious of their presence would presumably vary very much. I mean, the more a man was in the devil's power, the less he would be aware of it, on the principle that a man is still fairly sober as long as he knows he's drunk. It is the people who are fully awake and trying hard to be good who would be most aware of the devil. It is when you start arming against Hitler that you first realize your country is full of Nazi agents. Of course, they don't want you to know they are there. In the same way, the devil doesn't want you to believe in the devil. If devils exist, their first aim is to give you an anesthetic, to put you off your guard. Only if that fails do you become aware of them. A voice. Does Christianity retard scientific advancement? Or does it approve of those who help spiritually others who are on the road to perdition by scientifically removing the environmental causes of the trouble? Lewis. Yes, in the abstract it is certainly so. At a particular moment, if most human beings are concentrating only on material improvements in the environment, it may be the duty of Christians to point out, and pretty loudly, that this isn't the only thing that matters. But as a general rule, it is in favor of all knowledge and all that will help the human race in any way. Question 10. The Bible was written thousands of years ago for people in a lower state of mental development than today. Many portions seem preposterous in the light of modern knowledge. In view of this, should not the Bible be rewritten with the object of discarding the fabulous and reinterpreting the remainder? Lewis. First of all, as to the people in a lower state of mental development, I am not so sure what lurks behind that. If it means that people 10,000 years ago did not know a good many things that we know now, of course I agree. But if it means that there has been any advance in intelligence in that time, I believe there is no evidence for any such thing. The Bible can be divided into two parts, the Old and the New Testaments. The Old Testament contains fabulous elements. The New Testament consists mostly of teaching, not of narrative at all. But where it is narrative, it is, in my opinion, historical. As to the fabulous element in the Old Testament, I very much doubt if you would be wise to chuck it out. What you get is something coming gradually into focus. First you get, scattered through the heathen religions all over the world, but still quite vague and mythical, the idea of a God who is killed and broken and then comes to life again. No one knows where he is supposed to have lived and died. He's not historical. Then you get the Old Testament. Religious ideas get a bit more focused. Everything is now connected with a particular nation. And it comes still more into focus as it goes on. Jonah and the whale, the book of Jonah. Noah and his ark, Genesis chapters 6 to 8, are fabulous. But the court history of King David, 2 Samuel chapter 2, 1 Kings chapter 2, is probably as reliable as the court history of Louis XIV. Then, in the New Testament, the thing really happens. The dying God really appears, as a historical person, living in a definite place and time. If we could sort out all the fabulous elements in the earlier stages and separate them from the historical ones, I think we might lose an essential part of the whole process. That is my own idea. Question 11. Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? Lewis. Which of the religions of the world gives to its followers the greatest happiness? While it lasts, the religion of worshipping oneself is the best. I have an elderly acquaintance of about 80 who has lived a life of unbroken selfishness and self-admiration from the earliest years, and is, more or less, I regret to say, one of the happiest men I know. From the moral point of view, it is very difficult. I am not approaching the question from that angle. As you perhaps know, I haven't always been a Christian. I didn't go to religion to make me happy. I always knew a bottle of port would do that. If you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I certainly don't recommend Christianity. I am certain there must be a patent American article on the market which will suit you far better, but I can't give any advice on it. Question 12. Are there any unmistakable outward signs in a person surrendered to God? Would he be cantankerous? Would he smoke? Lewis. I think of the advertisements for White Smiles toothpaste, saying that it is the best on the market. If they are true, it would follow that 1. Anyone who starts using it will have better teeth. 2. Anyone using it has better teeth than he would have if he weren't using it. But you can't test it in the case of one who has naturally bad teeth and uses it, and compare him with a healthy Negro who has never used toothpaste at all. Take the case of a sour old maid who is a Christian but cantankerous. On the other hand, take some pleasant and popular fellow but who has never been to church. Who knows how much more cantankerous the old maid might be if she were not a Christian, and how much more likable the nice fellow might be if he were a Christian. You can't judge Christianity simply by comparing the product in those two people. You would need to know what kind of raw material Christ was working on in both cases. As an illustration, let us take a case of industrialism. Let us take two factories. Factory A, with poor and inadequate plant, and Factory B, with first-class modern plant. You can't judge by the outside. You must consider the plant and the methods by which they are run, and considering the plant at Factory A, it may be a wonder it does anything at all. And considering the new machinery at Factory B, it may be a wonder it doesn't do better. Question 13. What is your opinion about raffles within the plant, no matter how good the cause, which, not infrequently, is given less prominence than the alluring list of prizes? Lewis. Gambling ought never to be an important part of a man's life. If it is a way in which large sums of money are transferred from person to person without doing any good, e.g. producing employment, goodwill, etc., then it is a bad thing. If it is carried out on a small scale, I am not sure that it is bad. I don't know much about it, because it is about the only vice to which I have no temptation at all, and I think it is a risk to talk about things which are not in my own make-up, because I don't understand them. If anyone comes to me asking me to play bridge for money, I just say, "How much do you hope to win? Take it and go away." Question 14. Many people are quite unable to understand the theological differences which have caused divisions in the Christian Church. Do you consider that these differences are fundamental, and is the time now ripe for reunion? Lewis. The time is always ripe for reunion. Divisions between Christians are a sin and a scandal, and Christians ought at all times to be making contributions towards reunion, if it is only by their prayers. I am only a layman and a recent Christian, and I do not know much about these things. But in all the things which I have written and thought, I have always stuck to traditional dogmatic positions. The result is that letters of agreement reach me from what are ordinarily regarded as the most different kinds of Christians. For instance, I get letters from Jesuits, monks, nuns, and also from Quakers and Welsh dissenters, and so on. So it seems to me that the extreme elements in every church are nearest one another, and the liberal and broad-minded people in each body could never be united at all. The world of dogmatic Christianity is a place in which thousands of people of quite different types keep on saying the same thing. And the world of broad-mindedness and watered-down religion is a world where a small number of people, all of the same type, say totally different things and change their minds every few minutes. We shall never get reunion from them. Question 15. In the past, the Church used various kinds of compulsion in attempts to force a particular brand of Christianity on the community. Given sufficient power, is there not a danger of this sort of thing happening again? Lewis. Yes. I hear nasty rumours coming from Spain. Persecution is a temptation to which all men are exposed. I had a postcard signed M.D., saying that anyone who expressed and published his belief in the virgin birth should be stripped and flogged. That shows you how easily persecution of Christians by the non-Christians might come back. Of course, they wouldn't call it persecution. They'd call it compulsory re-education of the ideologically unfit, or something like that. But of course, I have to admit that Christians themselves have been persecutors in the past. It was worse of them because they ought to have known better. They weren't worse in any other way. I detest every kind of religious compulsion. Only the other day I was writing an angry letter to the Spectator about church parades in the Home Guard. Question 16. Is attendance at a place of worship or membership with a Christian community necessary to a Christian way of life? Lewis. That's a question which I cannot answer. My own experience is that when I first became a Christian, about 14 years ago, I thought that I could do it on my own, by retiring to my rooms and reading theology, and I wouldn't go to the churches and gospel halls. And then later I found that it was the only way of flying your flag. And, of course, I found that this meant being a target. It is extraordinary how inconvenient to your family it becomes for you to get up early to go to church. It doesn't matter so much if you get up early for anything else, but if you get up early to go to church, it's very selfish of you, and you upset the house. If there is anything in the teaching of the New Testament which is in the nature of a command, it is that you are obliged to take the sacrament, and you can't do it without going to church. I disliked very much their hymns, which I considered to be fifth-rate poems set to sixth-rate music. But as I went on, I saw the great merit of it. I came up against different people of quite different outlooks and different education, and then gradually my conceit just began peeling off. I realized that the hymns, which were just sixth-rate music, were nevertheless being sung with devotion and benefit by an old saint in elastic-sided boots in the opposite pew. And then you realize that you aren't fit to clean those boots. It gets you out of your solitary conceit. It is not for me to lay down laws, as I am only a layman, and I don't know much. Question 17. If it is true that one only has to want God enough in order to find him, how can I make myself want him enough to enable myself to find him? Lewis. If you don't want God, why are you so anxious to want him? I think that in reality the want is a real one, and I should say that this person has in fact found God, although it may not be fully recognized yet. We are not always aware of things at the time they happen. At any rate, what is more important is that God has found this person, and that is the main thing.